Jr. was my father. Now, if you could just imagine that these walls aren't here and look up the hill, you could see this house. This is Tillie Paul's house. Tillie Paul Tamaree by that time, the house that William Tamaree built for her when she came back to Wrangell eventually in 1904. The house is no longer standing, but it would be visible right out this way, towards the school. I will be speaking on about the Shquindy shaman's necklace and how Tillie became a Christian this morning. I feel the need to tell you a little bit about myself because it has a bearing on my biased opinion or my knowledge of Christianity. So I'll just take a couple of minutes to do that. Beginning, I think, when my father, who went to Ketchikan High School and is a quarter Tlingit, his Tlingit name is Suhuk Ish, which I think means father of a warrior. But after law school at the University of Washington, he came right back to Juneau, Alaska. He had written his law thesis on native claims, native rights, and he was just loaded for bear, as they say, to get back into the fight for Alaska Native land claims. And he, between the time of 1939 and 1952, he was Grand Camp Secretary 6 times. So he really poured his life into the fight, the battle. It ended with the Teton versus United States case in 1953, I think it was, and then he turned his back on Alaska. He took his family, my brother and sister and mom. We moved to North Seattle, 542 Northeast 94th Street. But I grew up in the north end of Seattle as a white kid. Dad could not be non-native up here. Everybody knew the Paul name. The Paul name, and but down in Seattle, he could just be a lawyer. Part of it was an attitude, sort of a residual sort of racism that happens with victimized people like the Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian, that if you wanted a good lawyer, you got a white one. And he couldn't pass for a white lawyer in Southeast Alaska. So he went down to Seattle and became a King County prosecuting attorney until 1969. Dad was a good lawyer. He was on the civil side there in King County, and he happened to win a big case against Boeing. And Seattle at that time was a one-horse town, so to speak. If you didn't want to do that, they asked, "What are you doing this for? You get this huge tax case. You're going to win. You should back off." Well, that wasn't the Paul way, and he couldn't be dishonest, so he won the case. It was a tax case that Boeing ended up paying $750,000 in 1968, and ongoing taxes too. Cost him his job. He was his boss was an elected position and didn't get reelected, so William Paul Jr. was out. And I graduated from high school in 1969. It was the 60s. I think there's some people here that remember the 60s. The 1960s. I'm going to be talking about the 1860s too. So So for me, basketball kept me in high school, and I graduated, and but Vietnam was hanging over everybody's head at the time, and times get very worrisome there. I did not have to go because I had a high draft number, the high lottery number, and but I still got out of high school, and marijuana was on the rise then, and boy, the pills we took, we didn't know what we took, but we took them, and got married, got divorced by the age of 21, and I turned into a lonely person, and it was painful, although it was an uncomplicated divorce, so no kids involved, very little money. But I felt pain for the first time, and I wanted some answers. So I became a Christian through quite a set of circumstances, which I'll skip over for now. But I ended up in a church called Emmanuel Bible Church. It was an IFCA church, that's Independent Fundamental Churches of America, also known as the Fightin' Fundies. And just immersed myself in that church for the next 9 years. I went to their Bible college, learned theology and New Testament Greek, and found out that I did pretty well in school, so I went on to North Seattle Community College, and then to the University of Washington, and Seattle Pacific University. I mentioned Emmanuel because it was a missionary church. They had lots of missionaries, as many as 70 missionaries. For the 9 years, I saw missionaries coming and going, and heard about this organization and that, met dozens of missionary kids. Some of them are still my friends. But I left that church in 81 because of other opportunities, and because they had grown a little proud, or a lot proud of their missionaries. And they began to focus on what they were doing to spread God's word and all, and became proud of themselves rather than proud of what the Creator can do for you and the love for all people everywhere. So I mention that because I think I know the mind of a missionary pretty well. And in a study of Tillie Paul, you have to talk about missionaries. I've read all the books on Southeast Alaska missionaries from that time period. I inherited my grandfather's book collection and all his papers. And he had everything. He had all the anthropologists and all the missionary books published in that time. S. Hall Young and Sheldon Jackson, Reverend Lindsay from Portland. I'll be quoting from it, and it kind of begs a question of what are we going to do with these books? Like S. Hall Young, he lived in Wrangell for 10 years, from 78 to 88, 1878 to 1888, and was very influential in this village. If you read his book, you run into words like uncivilized and savage, and then and then he has one chapter that says the worst savages. You think, oh boy, what's this going to be about? It's about 3 white men. So he had a perspective there that is, I think, worth listening to if you can. And he was a good writer. He published other books. He had a couple of canoe trips with John Muir that he did. Sheldon Jackson will talk about his writing a little bit later. I'm going to. I might mention that in 1995, my aunt Frances DeGermain, who received her button blanket and was received into the Nanyai right on Shakes Island here in 1940. But she organized a naming ceremony, and that's when I and my son Jared Cook Clan, Big Box, he received his name at that time, and many other Paul family members. And it was at that time that I really began to dive into Paul family history, and it's a lot. If you come to my house in Seattle, you can help me unpack boxes. But I want to start Tillie's life, pick up her life when she gets back to Wrangell from Victoria. Her mother, Ketchikan, she ran away from James Kinnan, if that really was his name, who is Tillie's father, back to Wrangell, and this was probably 1865 or 6. That time period is very hard to get dates right. Tillie didn't know how old she was. She remembers being told when the Civil War was over, and how old you have to be to remember something like that, and how soon did that message get through to Alaska? There was no telegraph up here at that time. But she gets back up here and with her older sister Margaret, and she lives in Snook's house. But her mother gets very sick and does pass away shortly after coming back to Wrangell. Tuberculosis. Tillie holds her hand until it goes cold. That night, the rest of the household was at a party. There was just one slave in the house to tend the fire, and Tillie and her mother and Margaret, her older sister. Ketchikan dies. Tillie goes off and hides in the storage boxes. And now comes this man, Snook. He's the brother of Chief Shakes, Nanyai. His reputation, or S. Hall Young describes him in his book as being a big man, 6 feet tall, big boned. This would have been a description from when Hall Young got into Wrangell. That would be 1878. Snook had the reputation of being able to kill a grizzly bear with a musket and a big spear that he had made that had a shaft on it that was 1.5 feet long. The musket was just to get the grizzly bear's attention and to make him mad so that he would charge. And then it was a battle of man with spear against a really angry grizzly bear. He was considered kind of a Superman of the village, to be able to do something like this. He was the big guy of the village. Well, he gets home from the party and something very powerful happens. And I think that most people in here can have felt that power. Because it goes on and it's universal. Snook gets home and Tillie comes out from hiding, and she raises her arms up to him. A 5-year-old girl raising her arms up to the strongest man in town. And Snook was slain, smitten with love for this little girl. Perhaps you've felt that. She must have a party. She must have Kuich in her name. Her name must be elevated. She'll be named Kakliud, which means highly esteemed one. Tillie remembers the party sitting on top of a mountain of blankets, gifts to be given with her sister, and looking down on the dancers. And she must have a pole, too, erected in her name with a flying raven on top. And the purpose of that is to atone for her white blood, which, looking from this side of history, is kind of is there that much wrong with white people that you need to atone for their blood? Well, to quote another missionary, Lindsley was from Portland. He was just before Sheldon Jackson got involved up here. He wrote a little book called Sketches of Alaska, and it has a lot of Wrangell history in it. And time he came up here in 1880, one of the Ankawus of the Wrangell told him, before you came, we thought all white men were bad. And such was the case back then. Of course you had to put up a pole to atone for white blood because all white men were bad. But I think Snook was also trying to establish possession here too, because he was Nanyai. He was married to a Teton woman, Unsalat, well as Teton, and that was all very good. But the Teton wanted both girls back, and he said, "Well, you should have said something before I threw a party and put up the pole." And but there was a lot of dying going on there, and you had to keep the women in the clan if you could. Well, they agreed on Margaret to go with the Teton Raven House, and Tillie, now going by the name of Katliud, which she simplified to Kataha, stayed with Snook. It was all very good because if you look at the harbor plan here for right over there, yeah, you can see that the Nanyai on Shakes Island and the Teton are just to the west there. So they're neighbors, they're friends. This is Emmons' drawing, which I've turned north and south and relabeled in modern Tlingit spelling, I guess. But except for Teton, I just can't break the habit of spelling Teton like that, or saying it like Grandpa used to say. So Margaret and Tillie Kataha, they still saw each other, and it was all very good that way. And it could have been that Kataha really landed on her feet after losing her mother and father, and now a rich man in town, strongest guy in town, loves her and would do anything for her. That sounds good. But Tillie gets sick. Kataha gets sick. Probably the same thing her mother had. She gets to the point where she's coughing up blood, and Snook can afford any doctor in town, he calls on the Teton Shaman Shquindy to come and work on her. What he actually says as far as the performance of shaman healing, we don't know. But we do know, because Tillie remembered, what the prophecy was concerning her. This is the actual necklace and the spirit catcher of Shaquindi that was used on Kataha. And the prophecy was this: that Kataha would not die of this coughing sickness. Kataha would live to an old age and have children. And the third part, she would be like a man to her people. Well, the first part, it's sort of a classic prophecy style to prophesy something that will happen pretty soon and then something in the future that will happen. Tillie gets better. We don't know if it was miraculous or instantaneous, or if it took a month or even a year, but there does come a time when she thinks, I'm not going to die of this. And the people around her, they look at her and they say, she's going to live. She's getting over this. She's getting better. Shquindy was right. I wonder if he's right about the second part of the prophecy, that she will grow old and have children. This can be very empowering. If you think that a truth has been told about you that happens in the future, you can get very confident in life. Also, a near-death experience, which probably in a group like this, there's several people that have had near-death experiences. I have had one, and 36 years ago, I almost died of duodenal ulcer and lost pulse and heartbeat for about a minute and a half. I was in a hospital, and a nurse revived me, but you get an idea in your head that you have a purpose in life once that happens, that you're still here for a reason. And I think Tillie experienced that too. That third part, what does that mean, though? She'd be like a man to her people. Katliud is a man's name. Perhaps Shaquindi picked up on something there. What did Shaquindi mean by that? The role of women at that time was, some of it was exactly the same. A matrilineal society, there's a certain amount of power that resides with the woman because of that, because the clan is passed on there and property is passed on that way. But another difference was the public leadership, public speaking. The head man of the village still went to war, whether it was with words or however the war was. I'll give an example of what I think was going on. A couple of examples. Tillie ends up being very bilingual. She learned English very fast. She was already trained with the Teton history and the Nanyai history coming from the family that she did, so she knew both worlds fast, and she had a real aptitude apparently for languages. And one of the ways that was encouraged and grew was through sermon translation. I don't know if any of you have done translating, but going back to my Emmanuel days, I heard several interpreters going there, and I thought, man, this must be quite a job to do this. And typically she would get a written out sermon beforehand, and so she didn't have to just do it on the wing. And a lot of this was with S. Hall Young right here in Wrangell. Still, if you're going to learn 2 languages, that's an excellent way to do it. Just do sermon translation. In 1902, she had gotten so good at public speaking that Sheldon Jackson took her to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, back to the Presbyterian convention back there, big convention. Presbyterians at this time, and a lot of Christian religions still don't allow women to talk to mixed groups, and they're growing out of it now, I would say. But back then, it was more of a rarity to let a woman speak in front of a group of mostly men, and at a Presbyterian convention. Well, she goes with him for 2 reasons: to speak at the convention and to let me find that picture. There we are. 1902, that's their formal photograph taken in New York. That's William Lewis Paul, her son, who was at Carlisle Indian School at that time. So she had 2 purposes to go back there: one, to visit her son, and to speak at this convention. And when she spoke at this convention, they asked her to keep speaking for another 15 minutes twice. And she spoke so well. It was unheard of. Just to touch on William Lewis Paul at Carlisle, it's sort of an enigma with a boarding school like that William Lewis Paul did so well at Carlisle Indian School that he counts as one of the great experiences of his life. Now, part of that was because he was already at Sheldon Jackson School, and he knew English really well already. So he did not have this language barrier that I assume most natives had that went 3,000 miles across the country to an Indian boarding school. William Lewis Paul does very well there. He calls Pratt, the head of the school, one of the great men of his era. I just scratch my head on that, but having read some about the Indian school there. But is that part of the Shquindy's meaning of being like a man to her people, being able to get up and public speak? I think maybe it is. The other The other story has been mentioned by Jocelyn already, and that is the voting story, which happened here in Wrangell. Briefly, how it goes down is Charlie Jones, 1922, goes down to vote. They don't let him vote. You're an Indian. He comes back up the street and goes to Tillie's house and says, they won't let me vote. Tillie marches him back down and says, this guy has the right to vote. And well, they're both arrested, and I won't go into the rest of the story, but the toilet paper defense and all that. But it's a woman leading a man. Maybe that's part of what Shquindy meant. Now let me follow through with the story of the spirit catcher. Just to let you know how it came back into the possession of Tillie. Walter, I think this is the Walter Waters curio store that she would have known in Wrangell. Looks like about a 1920s automobile there. But Shquindy died. We don't know when. We think we know where his grave is, but there was a grave robber that robbed his grave. We think about 1910, and Tillie gets word of it. I think she already had some kind of relationship with the Walter Waters, at least the store, and she may have gotten tipped off that way. Anyway, she confronts the white man who has stolen Shquindy's things. And there's one report out there that says Tillie threatened to put a hex on him. I don't see Tillie really talking that way. It's not. She's a devout Christian at that time, and it's not something that she would have done. However, she may have said something like, "It's a shaman's necklace. If you steal a shaman's necklace, then there's consequences. Of course, if you steal anything, there's consequences, and you put yourself under the power of whatever it is you steal." Anyway, next morning, in a bag on Tillie's porch, the necklace and spirit catcher show up. It also had a baton with it that Shaquindi used, but it was lost in the Goldstein fire of 1939. Another thing that happened with Walter Waters' curio store is that Tillie discovers that the Teton Raven hat also shows up in that store. And it's our Teton Raven hat. It's in the museum now. And the museum doesn't own it. It's here for safekeeping. I think I'm going to read from Louis Frederick, my Uncle Fred's will right now, because it has a bearing on this, on the connection between the shaman's necklace and the Teton Raven hat. Uncle Fred died in '94, and among other things, he lists three things specifically that he would like to see happen, or that items that he would like to see go. One was a piece of property on Whidbey Island. Another was this book, Then Fight for It, story of the Alaska Native Claims Act, which he was the foremost lawyer in for the North Slope people. And then the other thing was specific Indian artifacts. The Teton Shaman's necklace and spirit catcher, to my 4 children. It is my hope that my children will independently arrange that these artifacts join the Teton Raven tribal hat at the Alaska State Museum in Juneau. At the time of this writing, the hat was still in the State Museum in Juneau, where William Lewis Paul, the caretaker of the hat, had put it because he was just so worried about fire. The Goldstein building fire, he lost everything. There was the 1944 Hoonah fire, and then Wrangell had its fire in 52. And so the Teton necklace and spirit catcher is with the Teton Raven hat. Now, only in a better place, really, than Juneau. Nothing against Juneau, really, but Wrangell was the home of both of these items. And for the time being, at least, we think it's very appropriate that the necklace and the spirit catcher is closer to where it was put, where Shquindy requested that it be put. It's kind of hard putting things back in a open grave site. Shamans were not cremated, but they were above ground, and who's to say it wouldn't just come up missing again? So this is a step in the right direction, in my opinion. Now we get back to Kataha. I think a lot of people here know the history of Wrangell in the 1860s. There's been already quite a mention of it. 1867, U.S. buys Alaska, and 1868, the bombardment of Wrangell. After that horrendous Christmas party that William Tamaree records for us, both in English and there's also, we're working on a telling of William Tamaree telling that story in Tlingit too. It was on a big reel-to-reel, which Sea Alaska Heritage Institute is working on making it so that people can actually listen to it. 1870, gold rushes are gearing up. 72, miners coming into town. What is Snook supposed to do with a daughter who is approaching adolescence? I mean, I have 2 sons, but I feel for the guy. I said, what are you going to do here? He couldn't take his eyes off her. She would be taken, and there was just a lot of bad things going on in that way. So a wedding, a marriage invitation comes from a Tsimshian man down in Port Simpson, and wow, that sounds good. Get her out of town, because the only time she was, her happiest times down in Wrangell were when she could get out of Wrangell and go to summer camp over in Lake Bay and the Teton territory over there. That must have seemed like heaven, really. But send her to the Tsimshian down in Port Simpson. So he does. He accepts the payment and from this Tsimshian man and sends her on a boat down to Port Simpson. Well, I can't really say that it's a mistake, but it was a very hard thing to do, to send a young adolescent girl, probably 13 years old, to a place where she doesn't know the language even. She doesn't speak anything but Tlingit at the time, and some Chinook, but no Tsimshian. So she gets down there, steals a canoe, and starts paddling back north. I have no idea how the alternative was to stay and marry this guy. Nothing. No, we're going. But she makes it a few miles and exhausts herself, and they find her asleep on a rock. And a woman comes up to her who can communicate with her and says, you know, you don't have to marry this guy. You could go to the missionaries down there. We're becoming Christians down here, and we don't have to follow the old ways. Well, Tillie's on that in a heartbeat, and she goes to the Reverend Crosby and his wife, who are fairly newly started in Port Simpson at that time, and she goes and she lives with them. For 3 years she is with them. And she has to learn how to do menial tasks, housework, laundry, regular everyday cooking and cleaning, and which she has not had to do in her life because Snook's a rich man, and they had slaves that did that sort of thing, all the dirty work. Snook finds out about it, and he's really upset. Send her back. But Crosby won't do it because from his point of view, he doesn't know Snook and that he really loves this Kataha. He just sees a man who has sold a 13-year-old girl into marriage, and he's not going to allow that to happen again. How does he know? Well, she is with the Crosbys for 3 years and begins learning English. She's very good at it, as I have said. And then comes Sheldon Jackson with Amanda McFarland. And, I'm already there. Sheldon Jackson has come to Wrangell before and seen the great need that they had there when the most vulnerable part of the population is young girls, with all the minors around, and so he finds Amanda McFarland to come up and start Amanda McFarland's Home for Girls, which this is a sketch out of Sheldon Jackson's book. And the school, the home burnt down about 2 or 3 years after it was started, and they built a new one. So, but Tillie got back to Wrangell in 1877, as soon as it was ready to go. Amanda McFarland was actually alone in the town. Sheldon Jackson took off and did other work and left her there alone until S. Hall Young shows up in '78. And now they've got a real mission and a possible church going. In the Presbyterian Historical Society archive, which they've done some good work on digitizing old photos. This past year I found I'm not very good with my fingers. This is the oldest photo that I've ever seen of Tillie Paul. She's still Tillie Kinnan at that time. This is part of a bigger picture that you can find on the Presbyterian Archive. The children are all numbered and there you see Tillie Kinnan, and somebody has added Paul there. This must have been a later copy of it, but there she is. She's about 16 years old at that time. Tallest one there. It is at that time where Tillie has no place else to turn. When she tries to run away from Port Simpson, and at that time she gets back to the Crosbys and she prays her first prayer to the Christian God in Chinook, which is it's not really a language, it's just a jargon, a trade jargon, but it was good enough. And I count that time as being the beginning of embracing Christianity, which she does for the rest of her life. There were some influential people in Wrangell at that time. One of them was a Tsimshian man named Claw, who came up just before Amanda McFarland got here and was evangelizing the natives here. Another person was Sarah Dickinson, who was married to a white man, and as soon as she found out that there was a white missionary in Wrangell, she dropped her berry picking up the Stickeen and came rushing back. She was so anxious to have a real missionary in town. Sarah is an important figure because we have her listed as Duckluedi from Tongass. That would be Tlingit, but in other places she's mentioned as a Tsimshian person. There may be some confusion because she was fluent in Tsimshian and Tlingit and English. Very intelligent woman. Very important. A sermon translator that Tillie learned from. They were good friends. I think that the end here, and you can be thinking of questions if you want. I'm just going to go through some of my favorite pictures of Tillie. They have about another half a dozen here that are There's a picture of Tillie in her house, just up on the hill here. And she died in 1952. Shortly after the fire that happened, she was so attached to this town that I think that was the straw that finally ended her life. Apparently half the village, the dockside, burnt. And she was right there. She was a witness to the whole thing. And she passed away. But there's a row of Bibles up there. She was a spiritual leader to the end. There's a good one with no glasses on. I bet you that person has a sense of humor, I think. It is the same blouse, only with the glasses on. Her eyes were quite bad at the end. Next to her is her daughter-in-law, my grandmother, Frances Lackey Paul, married to William Lewis Paul. And I would like to emphasize that William Lewis Paul and his wife, Frances, were quite the dynamic duo. They both did a lot. Some of the weavers here still use Grandma's book on Tlingit spruce root basketry. She was not a weaver, but she was a documenter and history keeper for this sort of thing, and she got the BIA to make a publication for her. And a little kid next to me is Blair. We call him Blair 1 now, but he's older than me. First grandchild, and that's his father, Fred Paul. My Uncle Fred, also a lawyer. 4 generations there. This picture is a little mysterious because I think from the look of Tillie in the back there, I think she's wearing her white A&S dress there, but everybody else has got a button blanket on. I think it's 1946 because there was an A&B convention, Grand Camp in Wrangell at that time. And I think that's what the get-together is there. But she's standing in the back there, kind of the only one looking at the camera. Let's see. Oh, this is a good one here. These pictures at Sheldon Jackson. Sitka Training School. Nice looking group there. On the end here is Sheldon Jackson in the hat, and that's Tillie standing behind Sheldon Jackson, holding baby Louis, who she was still pregnant with when her husband, Louis Paul, was killed. So she's a single mom with 3 boys. The other boys that would be William in the white in front there, and his older brother Samuel, who was mostly raised by someone else because it was too much for Tillie to do. The ancient belief of the Tlingit is that the souls of the departed often return to earth in some child. For proof that is a reincarnation, very slight proof is sufficient. He's talking like a lawyer. In my case, the great Shaquindi had a lock of white hair near the center of his head. When I was born with this very distinct birthmark, everybody knew that Shaquindi had returned. Here's another Sheldon Jackson picture. I love this look on Tillie's face there. She's got some confidence there. I'm doing all right. How long do I have till? Time for questions? No. I will be around for 4 days, and Jared and I will be around 4 days, so if you want to look at pictures, and just approach me. Oh, that's a very, very nice hat, too.